One of the things about life that makes it so difficult is the fact that we are always finding ourselves in knots. Some of those knots we've been tied into by our parents when we're growing up. Some of those knots we find ourselves tied into because of society, culture, norms. But over time, we find that many of those knots are knots that we tied ourselves into. When you look at a lot of the problems that people have, a lot of the situations that are causing suffering, most of that is due in part to the knots that they have tied themselves into. And those knots can be situational, such as marriage, can be their job, their relationship, their finances, things that they have placed themselves into. And the funny thing about it is, it feels good to tie ourselves into knots. It feels good when you initially got that job. It feels good when you commit to that relationship. It feels good when you buy certain things or charge them to your credit card. It feels good. And that's the trick of getting you into the knot in the first place. But somewhere along the way, you find that the situation that you've placed yourself into is not a situation that works on your behalf. It's no longer something that aligns with your truest, highest self. And this is what causes depression and a lot of the suffering. The knots that we have tied ourselves into don't align with our truest and our highest selves. And unfortunately, a lot of times, people tie themselves into knots that they are unwilling to untie themselves from. Because to untie themselves from those knots requires a lot of energy, it requires a lot of sacrifice, and sometimes it requires a lot of pain and suffering, and sometimes it requires giving up something that you've worked so hard for, and sometimes it requires giving up something that you love. And so we suffer, and we look for things to help us through that suffering. I mean, it's very interesting that people will pray and look for answers on how to remain in a situation where they're suffering rather than how to get out of it. Because even they understand that to get out of it won't be cheap, it won't be easy, and it won't be free. It's going to cost something. It's going to take some work. And so the wise person, the person who's willing to shed skin for their next phase of life and for the next knots that they're going to tie in themselves into, because that's exactly what's going to happen. There's no way to get out of being in knots. The point is never to not be in knots, because you are always going to be tied in some knots. The point is to be tied into knots that align with your truest, highest self, and to be ready to shed those or to untie yourself when that is no longer the case. That's one of the significant keys to life. Because sometimes we tie ourselves into knots thinking, this is the knot for me, this is what I want. And you think you want that. And then you get into it and you realize, this is not what I wanted for myself. And it's an unfortunate and sad reality when people remain tied to those to those knots, and they cease to live. They just learn how to die in a way that they don't have to feel the suffering as much. It's like taking pills for a disease that you can't get rid of. And that's sort of what life is. We create diseases for ourselves, and we can get rid of them, but we choose to take pills instead because the work is too hard. And so what everybody has to do is take a serious look at their life, take an honest look at their life and the knots that they have tied themselves into, and be willing to go through the process of untying those knots. And if you must, be still until you find what knots you want to tie yourself into moving forward. Knots that are in alignment with who you are and who you want to be. Knots in alignment with a happy life. And then go after it. Because despite how much work that may take, your happiness is worth the work that you have to do to get to it.